Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Tasmina, for having us here. And it's my great pleasure to address this eminent group and to share some concluding words. To wrap it up, I would say more theoretically, because I'm a political scientist, so I will try to give some thoughts over these issues that were discussed today from my perspective as a young scholar. So, for many years, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization was criticized, and often rightly so, for its determinism and simplification. And yet, with some reluctance, we must admit that Huntington was right. He was not entirely wrong. What we are witnessing today is not only a friction between civilizations, but growing conflict within them. So there is not only clash of civilizations, but clash within each of the civilizations. Societies are fragmenting along economies, cultural and political lines. The clash is no longer all external, but it became internal. Civilizations are no longer coherent actors. They are constituted spaces divided by inequality, polarized by identity, and strained by economic insecurity. In this sense, the most dangerous clashes of our time are not at civilizational borders, but inside societies themselves. In fragmented society, the gap between economic indicators and lived experience widens dramatically. So, as you can see and hear, we are told that the global economy is recovering. We are told that markets are calm until they're not. We are told that growth figures are positive, yet anxiety remains high. Employment numbers improve, while trust in the future declines. This dissonance is not accidentally because it reflects a deeper truth, and that truth is that our economic indicators tell us what is happening, but not what is happening to us, the people. So people sense that something fundamentally is shifting, that the rules that once made effort legible, risk manageable, and progress plausible no longer operates as expected. This is not simply uncertainty, because people are sensing that this period is described as a loss of orientation. Scholars are frequently quoting Gramsci again these days, and I'll quote, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is a time of morbid symptoms," or as Zizek would say, the monsters, and this is the state of interregnum, so-called interregnum. So these processes are pointing out to the period when economic systems continue to function, but no longer pursued, and at the same time, authority persists while legitimacy weakens. In such a moment, crises do not appear as temporary disruption because they surface as morbid symptoms, or I might say persistent conditions that signal structural imbalances. Today, many of the symptoms are economic. We live in an era of unprecedented wealth creation. Global GDP has more than tripled since the early 90s, yet for many citizens, prosperity feels increasingly abstract. Real wages have stagnated, inequality has widened, global debt, public and private, now exceeded 300% of the world GDP, locking societies into cycles of vulnerability. At the same time, financial markets thrive. This is not a contradiction, but I might say it's a separation. Finance has become increasingly disconnected from the lived economy. Capital circulated faster, but benefits concentrated more narrowly. It is not wrong to conclude that the risk is socialized while returns are privatized. Yes, we can say that this is a failure of the markets, but not of the markets alone. This is a consequence of political choices made without political ownership. In response, we embrace the language of resilience. Resilient economies, resilient supply chains, resilient citizens, and so on. But resilience, when it means only the capacity to absorb shocks, become a quiet form of resignation. A resilient society that cannot change course, it is not adaptable to dysfunction. True resilience requires investment in the future. To just buffer against crisis is not enough. Also, it requires institutions that distribute risk fairly, and it also requires a sense of direction that makes endurance meaningful. Resilience, in other words, is a political achievement. Here, we encounter one of the central morbid symptoms of our time, and there is a shortage of leadership that is willing to frame economic choices as collective decisions. Economic governance has narrowed into management, and policy debates focus on calibration. We're not hearing the right word or the right keyword, which is purpose or meaning. Central banks act decisively, while political leaders hesitate to speak about trade-offs, priorities, and long-term visions. As a result of all of this, we have markets that operate without a social horizon, and also we have citizens that experience economic change as imposed rather than chosen. Trust erodes, not because people reject complexity, because, as some scholars might say, they reject silence. Let's say that when leadership abandons narrative, power continues without consent. Over the past decade, some of the world's most influential economists, among Stiglitz and Piketty, have issued remarkable consistent warnings that the prevailing model of global capitalism is not sustainable anymore. They have shown that extreme inequality is not a side effect, but a structural outcome of an economic system built on deregulation, financialization, and this declining redistribution. As Stiglitz has argued, this model has delivered slower growth than in the post-war decades while concentrating its gains overwhelmingly at the top. Piketty, on the other hand, warned European leaders that without new economic rules, Europe risks dying of austerity. Their critique is not a call for state dominance or domination of the economy, but for the restoration of its moral dimension, for reconnecting economic power with democratic accountability, and individual incentives with collective goals. When inequality reaches levels that undermine social cohesion and political legitimacy, it ceases to be an economic issue alone. It becomes a crisis of government. More than a century ago, sociologist Robert Michels offered a warning that felt disturbingly contemporary. He calls it the iron law of oligarchy, the idea that all complex organizations, including the democratic ones, tend over time to concentrate power in the hands of few. Michels was not arguing that democracy fails because citizens are irrational. He argued that democracy fails when economic organizational power accumulates faster than democratic control. When inequality deepens, political systems, they basically adapt. They're not neutral, and they adapt in the direction of oligarchy. The uncomfortable question today is not whether Michels was right or wrong, but whether we have finally stopped resisting his predictions. When wealth buys influence, when finance shapes policy more efficiently than voters, democracy slowly hollows out. This is not the end of democracy by force. It is the quiet transformation of democracy into managed consent. So, dear friends, the leadership gap becomes more consequential in the multipolar world. So now the true goal or the true challenge of this multipolar world is how we can frame this multipolar world in the frameworks of the current multilateralism. So multipolarity is often described as a concept that produces winners and losers. Why? Because the main challenge today is how to frame this, as I said, in the multilateral institutions. But in practice, it's produced something more unsettling, is the asymmetric of exposure. Large states can shift risks outwards. Financial centers can absorb volatility. Smaller and more open economies must live with uncertainty, but they did not design them. Yet even this framing misses the deeper issue. Multipolarity that is unmanageable disturbs insecurity. So at the end, I will say that this insecurity is unevenly distributed. Europe, whose strength lies in the rules and integration, is most exposed when institutions weakens. The global south, on the other hand, faces even sharper constraints: debt vulnerability, climate exposure, and limited voices in the global financial governance. Even major powers discovered that influence does not equal stability. Multipolarity without coordination amplifies fragmentations. So at the end, some might argue that leadership today is about choosing sides. And I don't agree with that. It is about choosing institutions capable of governing diversity and interdependence. It means treating finance as a moral and political system. It means reconnecting economic policy with democratic legitimacy in the era when market, by what was called democratic recession, is more than inevitable, unfortunately. And it means recognizing that the resilience without justice is instability, that we're just postponing it. These interregnums are dangerous, not because change is inevitable, because direction is absent. So we're living in this vacuum, in this time between two different times and epochs. So multipolarity without multilateralism creates winners without legitimacy and losers without voice. It normalizes instability, and all of that we are calling just realism. But realism without a vision is a simple resignation. History does not end in interregnums, hopefully. It waits for the true leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and please a special applause for the entire panel. Thank you again very, very much. Thank you.